I'm Matt Booker.
I'm Dave Laird.
I'm Diego Báez, and rappers are Miltonic Devils.
And I'm Andrea Laurencell Sheridan, and I'm about to embark on a brief interview with hideous men in the Great Concavity. I didn't fuck it up.
So
Welcome.
Thank you for your slightly accusatory, suggestive intro, Andrea. That's great. And welcome Diego as well to episode 37 of the Great Concavity. It's fantastic to have you guys on the show. Welcome.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks for taking the time. This is kind of we've started to begin the series, Matt, of having like dual guest episodes over the last few times. So we're just continuing on with that tradition here, you know?
Yeah, this is new territory, but it feels good.
Yeah, it does. The Skype setting up Skype's a little tougher than usual, but it's fine. We're making it work.
Oh yeah.
Oh yeah, cool. So friends, welcome. Diego, you and I have hung out at some of the conferences at ISU before. Andrea, I still haven't met you in real life before, but of course you guys are both on the Diversity Committee, specifically as coordinators of the International David Foster Wallace Society, of which, of course, our own Matt Booker here is the prez, and I'm a chairperson on it. So we've had lots of fun Google Hangouts with you guys talking about stuff related to the committee and of course specifically diversity, which is why we have you guys on the show to discuss that in the context of, you know, what the society's doing and in the larger context of Wallace's work and writing. So welcome to that.
Yeah.
Andrea, do you want to run us through a little bit of your bio? Tell us about what you do, who you are, and then Diego, and then we'll jump into some topics.
Sure. I currently teach anything they want me to teach at Orange County Community College. It's one of the SUNY community colleges in New York State. I don't know why I said New York State.
Not California,
not Orange County, California, or Florida. So it is cold, and we have been marred by snow days this semester, but I will never cut Wallace. I will cut poetry before I will cut Wallace.
Oh
no. No, because we can get through them faster. It's fine. But I actually never studied Wallace as a student before I started teaching him, so I didn't know if I was like missing something. But he was always sort of this polarizing topic in classes, almost like Sylvia Plath was when I was in college, that everybody either really, really, really loved him or hated him. And last semester I actually had one student come up to me and say, I hate how much I love him. Like, yeah, that's pretty much how it goes. So
that's actually an interesting starting point for the conversation we're about to have, I think.
That's actually what I called my presentation for this year's conference in Illinois. Yeah. Yeah, cool. And I created like an entire research paper assignment around it for that class because she was very, very right. Because they read Forever Overhead, which is like that nice little, well, aside from the first couple pages, but that nice little coming of age story. And then I have them read a lot of the brief interviews with hideous men, and then they don't like me so much and they get uncomfortable, but I make them talk about it anyway. But the first time I was a student reading Wallace was with Mary Holland in a class at SUNY New Paltz in 2013. Oh, wow. And I ended up enrolling and getting a second master's degree because of that class. And it was the worst grade I got the whole time I was at SUNY New Paltz. It wasn't a bad grade, but and I ended up writing my thesis with her as well.
Oh, cool.
So I actually took half of my classes in that program with her. Oh, wow. So I did a lot with Wallace in that program. And now nobody asks me at work anymore why I bother teaching him because there's a society, so I guess that counts for something. So thanks.
We've legitimized Wallace's place in the academy
Although,
now.
I did just find out you can join the Edgar Allan Poe Society for $2.
The Don DeLillo Society's free, so that's cool too. I'm on that.
So I don't know if that's enough of a history, but that's my thing.
Yeah, that's great. Awesome. You're also a frequent contributor on Hyperreality. Tell us a bit about that.
I was, and then I kind of got sick. But last semester, right around when Saturday Night Live got a little bit too real, I started getting inspired, and it's a website blog that a friend of mine runs, and I had like all these theories about satire and sincerity and all these sorts of things. So anything that I kind of became the resident Saturday Night Live examiner, and I was like deconstructing Saturday Night Live, and then it just got too scary, so I couldn't do it anymore. I can't watch the news. I can't do it.
That's pretty fair, I think, these days.
Yeah, but it's a fun blog website that we have both abandoned a little bit because we don't want to look at things like that.
Fair enough.
Cool. I'd rather read fiction. It's less scary.
Yeah. Depends whose fiction, I guess. But
and more believable too.
Yeah, I watched American Horror Story. That was much less terrifying.
Reasonable. And Diego, how about you? What's your scene, man?
Yeah, so I was actually born in Bloomington and grew up in Normal. I went to high school in Normal, and the only reason I include that is because it was so fun and surreal coming back for the first conference at ISU, and being simultaneously excited, and it's my home stomping grounds, and then also a little confused that the university itself wasn't or hadn't capitalized more on DFW's presence there. So it was exciting to see all these people come together and all that. When I was growing up, in high school, Wallace was teaching. He was kind of ending his time at ISU. I think it was after Infinite Jest had come out, and he sort of toured for that, and then before he moved out to California. And so I didn't have any exposure to him. Weirdly, there was a student at my high school named David Foster. And no relation or anything like that, and it's not even a Wallacean coincidence. It's just a weird coincidence. But I connected the name with this author, and I actually did a report on David Foster Wallace without really understanding who he was or what he's all about. I was 16, so I didn't really know what I was doing. But then I also, like you, Andrea, I didn't really come across Wallace in just my casual reading or anything, or even in school. It wasn't until grad school, and I went to grad school in Newark, in New Jersey, at Rutgers, and in a poetry workshop, my professor, Rachel Hadas, mentioned it. It was the day that he killed himself, and she kind of announced the news. And I knew who he was. Just he had a reputation. He was sort of a pop culture figure, at that point.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
And that was, morbidly, that's what spurred my interest. And so I started, the first thing I read was the Kenyan commencement speech and started teaching it. I read it and then taught it the next day in my remedial English class. And then cool. I just kept reading. I just kept reading it. And now here I am and teaching here in Chicago. I've lived back in Chicago for 6-7 years now. And I'm writing. I'm a poet. So that's cool.
Yeah, cool. And you're working on a novel right now as well?
Well, I just finished my poetry manuscript and sending out to contests and stuff, trying to get that out there in the world. And which I've actually read from that at the second DFW conference, which was cool.
Oh, right, yeah. I was there for that. I was in the room.
Really well. And now I want to switch it up, work on some fiction. I've been sort of writing a little bit of fiction here and there, but I really want to buckle down and do this time travel novel that I've been thinking about for so long, and yet still can't even explain well. I was at a wedding this week, and I was trying to give my elevator pitch version of it, and I just couldn't. So I need to really get that nailed down.
All right. Cool.
So, Diego, that you mentioned that second conference is an interesting point in the history of it for me, because, I mean, for one, that's where Dave and I met. But it was all, your perspective of seeing kind of the Wallace community formalize itself at those conferences is interesting, because, my perspective is a little bit different. And, I don't consider myself an academic. I'm not in the academic world. I don't have a grad degree. I'm not really an academic. My background really is starting my career in book publishing. And so coming at it from that, I felt like there were a lot of issues that would come up, and I met tons of new people at the first conference and the second conference. And, we're going into the fifth year of it now. And so it's a little more formalized and organized, and people know each other and, kind of know what to expect. But I felt like at the second conference, one of the biggest issues to me was this issue about, having kind of non-academic people even at a college campus for a conference. And that was something I was very interested in. Although I got to say, at the first conference, I met a ton of people who were new scholars. It was the first conference they have ever been to. And so they didn't feel like part of any establishment either. And they were writing on a lot of wildly different topics. And all through all these topics, there were not a lot, but there were a lot of different, approaches to literature and things that I would not have found out otherwise. And I feel like, I guess where I'm going with this is that I feel like now that issue that I was concerned with in 2014, 2015 is a little less important, or it seems a little settled. And, as soon as we launched the David Foster Wallace Society a little over a year ago, it was immediately clear that the issues that we would have to deal with right off the bat would have to be like, is it all white dudes?
With beards of varying lengths.
And it's like it's a question of representation, and we were audacious, I think, enough to put our pictures on the website, which opens yourself up to a level of scrutiny and attention. And then also, I think it's a legit concern because my experience of being on online Wallace community and then in the real world Wallace community was that there were in fact a lot of women involved, and that it was maybe truly a misrepresentation. And so we wanted to address that right off the bat. And I kind of want to get your perspective of what that was, both of you to chime in and answer this question, but what was your perspective? What was your concern? Did you feel like, I've also heard criticisms of us who've tried to start this society that it seemed very we're not including people. And so I didn't ever want that to be the case. And yet it's a difficult problem to address of how do you fix that? Fix all society's problem. It felt like a very difficult problem to address.
Yeah, and you even the first comment you made about the first conference sort of bridging or spanning these two spaces, at least two. Maybe there's three overlapping circles in a Venn diagram where you've got Wallace in the academy, right, as he's treated by the academy. Then you've got Wallace, the pop culture and sort of cult figure, and there's some overlap, but there's a lot of different emphases there. But then there's this third community, which I think you saw members of this community, it's less formal, people who maybe are not in the academy or writing for magazines or websites, and they're just interested. They're just readers, but coming together. And I did feel like the conferences, I felt a bit less. I liked that it was a blend of people from university and not. But it was like you mentioned, it was really conspicuously white, and there was a certain sort of profile, young male, white, bearded, a lot of them.
Guilty.
But to counter that, Yeah, well, yeah. I mean, but to counter that, like, I would give you guys credit for reaching out to I guess it was through the listserv that I would have heard about the call for the diversity committee. It wasn't like maybe you were getting some flack or maybe getting some feedback, but that you all went out and made that your initiative. Like, you took that upon yourselves to say, like, we want to do something about this. We don't really know what or how to do it, but we want to do something. And not every society or even like fan club is that like self-reflective. And I think it's been great. Like, some of the I don't want to we can talk about the posts in a second, but it's great. There is clearly a wide range of voices and people who are interested in Wallace for a variety of reasons, and then also who have a variety of kind of questions and concerns and problems with them too, which I think it makes it rich. I think it makes it interesting and worth pursuing. I
agree. I think there's kind of a larger problem in academia in general of being fairly monochromatic, if we're trying to be nice about it. It's I don't think it's going to be easy just for one society to fix that. I haven't been to any of the Illinois conferences yet. This year is going to be my first year. I went virtually last year, but I could only see Diego and Danielle and Ryan, I think. Oh, yeah. So that looked kind of diverse. There's Danielle up there. I don't know who was in the audience though. And then we went again virtually. We Diego and I were there for a Q&A for Oz Wallace, and from what Tony said, it was pretty half and half, at least in terms of gender diversity, which is the diversity that's easier to calculate, I guess, because people can check off a box, or you can tell by a name or something like that. But for me, the realization that the Wallace community was white bearded men I was kind of dense to it at first, because the class that I took was Mary Holland. I'm like, all right, woman teaching the class, and I looked around, and for undergrad I went to an all women's college, so I was used to classes being full of women, and then I walk into this David Foster Wallace graduate seminar, and it's a lot of men. I'm like, okay, maybe I'm just used to my all women environment. A lot of them had beards, but it was also New Paltz, which is a very liberal kind of hippie town. So it took me a while to realize that that's the kind of community that Wallace is associated with. It took going to that year. It was 2003. It was the spring of 2003, and that year there was a ton of Wallace panels at the ALA in Boston. And with the exception of Mary Holland, I think all of the presenters were male. They didn't all have beards. I think
Thank God.
Matt Mullins, I don't think he had a beard. Mike Miley, I don't think had a beard yet.
He does.
In 2013, I don't think he did.
Yeah.
He may, or maybe I just wasn't sitting close enough so I couldn't see it. But there were some beardless men at least. It might have been the blonde. So it took me a minute, but.
Now that you say that, though, it makes me think, in my perspective of this, it wasn't something I gave a lot of thought to in the early days. Like when I joined the Wallace list in like 1999, 2000, about half of the most prolific posters, people who replied to everything, were women. And there was also like a third category when it's just email and it's online. There were some people who you couldn't tell what their identity was because it was just an email address, or they didn't sign their post. So it wasn't like a lot of thought given into that. I mean, sure, I think there was some like subconscious awareness that there was a lot of people who were especially like young, highly educated males in certain environments and stuff were attracted to Infinite Jest. But I think after he died and he became more of like a cultural icon, there became a lot more attention and a lot more backlash to the types of this stereotype kind of came really more to the fore of like, this is the typical Wallace reader. And it was sort of, I felt like at the time it was sort of unique to him. Because like you were saying, like I've read other popular writers in college, and it's rare that, I mean, maybe there's some association with like, Kerouac or, Bukowski or something, where you're not going to see, too many women or people of color like embracing wholeheartedly. So I could think I didn't want Wallace to end up like that. You're right. Like I thought like he's better than that, and he's like more important than this. And so I think this is something that we wanted to talk about, like even if it's uncomfortable, or even if it's I don't know, hideous for us to embrace. But I feel like we've done a pretty good job, at least in trying to get more voices out there. And what's been interesting to me, Diego, is like a lot of the stuff we put on the diversity committee's blog posts, which have been phenomenal, didn't really get a ton of attention. Didn't really get a ton of like conversation. It was sort of like, when that conversation's out there, it's easier to ignore. It's sort of like easier to embrace like the stereotype. I was going to see what you thought. Maybe first just tell the listeners who might not be aware of like what the blog project was.
Oh yeah. So our first big project was it was initially conceived sort of as responses to DFW by folks who are not like him, right? So let's hear from women, let's hear from people of color, let's hear from anybody who's read Wallace and wants to point out or comment on or add to the conversation in a way that feels like, yeah, I'm a fan, and what's up with these weird racial slurs, etc., or whatever. And so a lot of the contributions have been, I mean, they've all been amazing. And I was just rereading the comment that you sent us, because I hadn't seen that had posted either, and there's not as much commenting or conversation that I wish that I would like to see grow, but those posts aren't going anywhere, and we hope this is just the beginning. And part of me wonders, and because there's this stereotype of you're right. The stereotype of the David Foster Wallace reader is not the like nerdy Latino kid in Bloomington Normal or whatever, Chicago, whatever. It's this stereotype that you hear about, or that I hear about all the damn time, which is it's especially young, 20 somethings, men, usually straight, who are on the warpath to letting everyone know that they need to read this person and they need to read Wallace, and if they don't, or if they suggest any nuance to or suggestions or critiques, that they are just missing the point, kind of thing. And I feel like that figure has become very well established in internet culture and like internet lit culture. I cannot say that I've actually met anybody like that.
That's what I was about to say. That person doesn't really exist. That person walks around or rides around on the subway with Infinite Jest in his hand as a prop, and probably hasn't actually read it, and their copy is tattered because it has been his prop for so long. But if you were to be like, oh, hey, what did you think of this scene? Or like, oh, hey, Eschaton, like, what?
Do you remember that comment Jason Segel made in an interview where he bought Infinite Jest before starting to film for the end of the tour, and the bookseller saying to him that every guy she's ever slept with has an unread copy of it on his nightstand? That kind of like that prop as as an impressive, as trying to like impress people or whatever.
There's I'm sort of interrupting you, Diego, but it's relevant. There was a movie. It wasn't that good, but I watch a lot of not that good movies. I think it was called Liberal Arts. Did any of you see that? It is called
Liberal Arts. Yeah. We've talked about it on the show before. That book I agree with you. It's not
such a prop in that movie. It's like, it's quite silly. It reminds me of like Desdemona's scarf in Othello. Like, it's just this thing that you can follow around, and like I don't think anybody in that movie knew what that book was about, but they knew what it came to represent, and like Wallace would have hated like this empty symbol that book has become. Like, it might as well be a lunchbox.
Yeah.
Like maybe it would be more useful and like just make the cover a lunchbox and then they can carry something else in it at least.
He's never actually mentioned by name, nor is the book. Isn't that right, Andrea? They never
I
say
don't
his
think
name.
so.
They do show a cover of like kind of a cloudy motif. It's not the exact cover of the first edition though. And then they make quotations of some of Wallace's comments about fiction, like, you know, the writer said that, you know, the purpose of fiction is to make us feel less lonely and things like that. So there is some like very specific reference there, but never by name. So it's you kind of have to know.
Because they probably didn't read it.
I wonder.
I get so mad at the people. There's so many people who comment on that book, and like we don't even have to get into all those articles that came out like last year. But
Right.
people have opinions on that book and on him and have never read it. Like I went through the trouble of reading the book. I think I hurt my elbow.
Tennis elbow?
Read the book and then talk. I'm almost positive I got tennis elbow reading that book because I had to read it in 4.5 weeks for Mary
Some
Home.
pretty rich irony in that.
Yeah.
What you're saying though, it sort of alarms me because it could, you know, I didn't used to worry about this. I was like, yeah, whatever. You know, there's plenty of smart people out there who do read it and care and, you know, respect him and whatever, and his writing, I should say. I mean, but recently we got an email from a listener, and I haven't asked him if I could share this story, but I'll just be vague about it. But it's a reading group for IJ that he started at a prestigious university recently. And immediately a few people emailed him and were like, what the hell, bro? Like, isn't that some awful bro guy? And you're not the bro, dude. Like, what is this? And so then it puts him in the position of having to like defend Wallace and being like, no, that's, you know, if you're skeptical, like come join the conversation or whatever. But I mean, that's sort of my fear, is that he just gets lumped into be like shorthand for like in a, you know, sexist or something, you know, like that's just shorthand for like, oh, well, why would you even want to go with that dude? Like, not only do people not read the book, but like don't really even investigate much further than that. Just that it has some like reputation as like, oh, that's the lit bro thing. Oh, that I don't want nothing to do with that. So I
mean, if we follow that logic, you pretty much discount every major author of the 20th and 21st century, and before that, right?
I don't know. I mean, I think there's some that would probably still get the same treatment. You know, like people who they live more by their reputation than people actually reading them.
Right.
And people would still read Jonathan Safran Foer. He's like sainted at this point.
I don't think much about him, to be honest.
Most Wallace people have that reaction too.
But I just think that this is something that it seems somewhat new, you know, at least in the past. Like if your teacher said, oh, we're going to read this guy, like people would be like, never heard of him, whatever, let's read it. You know, or it wasn't like there was this visceral reaction. So that seemed like a fairly new development. And I mean, I could probably speculate more on how we got there, but.
Yeah, and I wanted to go back to how we got on this thread, and I don't want to I don't want to discount the experience of, I mean, I'm sure there's plenty of young co-eds who do experience this right on campus, and they just roll their eyes and like, oh god, the lip bros again. and also I don't want to shit on like some young, you know, straight white dude who reads Wallace and has his mind blown. And hey, there are worse authors you could be relating to and like taking up as you know, identifying with. But that is so strange, right? The reputation precedes it to an extent that it's like, and it's such a poor sampling of the work, right? Like the dude wrote a lot. It wasn't just the one book. I mean, there's all kinds of different shit that was all weird and strange, and it's so strange that that's the reputation that is now sort of, what do we fight against it? Do we not? I mean, I'm trying to sort of complicate it, right? And get those voices, like those two commentators who came on to the blog, the DFW Society blog, and they really connected with what Sean Gander had said about, well, I was reading it, and then I come across these racial slurs, and they're just thrown in. They're not problematized or investigated, and also there's not really any other characters to take up the mantle of of minority or person of color in a redeeming way. And so it takes us out of it. And one of the commentators said something that we could think about or debate, but he said that for white readers, it doesn't rattle them. They kind of just scan it over, and some, like, worst case scenario, just kind of believe it as a truthful representation or something. Whereas other people may read it, people of color especially, read it, and it's really jarring. It's almost insulting. It's like a smack in the face. You're like, yo, I was really enjoying this book, man. I'm on like page 700, and then you got to throw that in my face. It's like, what is this about?
And I think that's something that hasn't really been grappled with publicly a lot, without being, just dismissed, where it's easy to just be like, oh, well, it's a book for white people, and there's not a lot of, non-white people in it who are not like caricatures. And it's like, well, like you're saying, I think it's more complex than that, but I do think that is something that at least amongst the white people probably in the past didn't debate. A lot of like that debate didn't come up because there's so many details in the book, and it's like, well, this is one detail, and it's like, well, if you're this type of reader, especially like Sean Gandert says, you know what, it stuck out like a sore thumb pretty bad. And it's like, hearing his voice and putting it out there, I hope that other people come to that post and leave their comments on it too, because I think it hasn't been much of the public conversation up until now.
I agree.
For anyone who has access to a computer while they're listening to this right now, who's not like driving their car, what is the specific link to the blog site that we're talking about so people can go check it out? We'll link to it obviously later, but.
Yep. It's on the dfwsociety.org. It was one of our, I don't know if it was one of our first, but it's called A Short Meditation on the Whiteness of David Foster Wallace's Writing. July 15th.
Right, cool.
And one thing I liked about this piece too is that it kind of grapples with another question that a lot of other writers have grappled with, which is like, how do you handle that? How should you write about people of color whenever that's not your experience? Like, what is the line between like co-opting someone's story and then ignoring the existence of minorities, and like different people who are not like you? And Wallace, I mentioned in one piece recently that like, his first novel is from the point of view of a woman, and it's like how, what do you make of that, Andrea?
Yeah, that was the when I took the Wallace class, we read everything in chronological order, and I read cool. that, and I sort of felt that she was an empty character. I don't feel like she was very much a woman. I didn't identify with her as a woman. I feel like she could have been Pete, and nothing would have changed that much. Other than the Rick Vigorous character. I honestly think that he is why the protagonist had to be a woman, because you can't have him without Lenore. But it almost reminds me kind of like an Oedipa Maas character, where she's sort of empty too. And what I mean by empty is like there's not a whole lot going on that makes them identifiable as a woman. With Oedipa Maas, it's more just like she has all these men that she relies on, and then she loses her men.
That's pretty apt reading of Crying of Law 49. Yeah,
yeah, that's my take on it. I wrote a paper where I compared her to Odysseus because he too loses his men at some point. Yeah, that's I make very weird connections, so I apologize for that in advance. But
I dig it.
I don't think that there's anything internal about her that like screams womanly to me. And I don't know if it was because I didn't have much of a background in like Wittgenstein, so I was struggling with that. But even like going back and looking at it, I don't read her as much as how it's coming out. It sounds really bad, but I don't read her as much of a woman. She's just sort of this agendered character, and she sort of had to be a woman for the sake of the characters around her. So I don't think he wrote her misogynistically, and I don't think he wrote like it's not like some of the really, really egregiously badly written characters in Infinite Jest, like any non-white character in Infinite Jest, like what was going on with them. But she wasn't like, it's not like I'm gonna go around and be like, oh my god, I'm so Lenore Beadsman, and she's like my spirit animal or something, because there's not a lot to her as a woman, if that makes any sense.
I think you're right. I mean, my perspective on that was that it just seemed like a stand-in for him.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah,
like it was just like another, like change the name, change his character slightly. I mean, he wrote it when he was very young, and it was, the early 1980s. But I also think that that's a pretty complex thing to try to identify where he fails in that, because what you're saying is like the absence of gender doesn't necessarily make it a success. And that if, this is a criticism of other male writers I've seen, when they try to write a woman, they're like, oh, and she was, aware of her breasts moving through, as she was walking everywhere. And it's like so over the top, like focusing on every aspect of her gender.
I gotta say, that's not my experience as a woman usually. I'll keep you updated, like, but that's not usually how I walk through the world.
See? So, I mean, don't write that. But it's like, well, then if you sort of ignore the femaleness, the gender, then does it really just seem like you're not capable of writing it, though? Like I don't really know what the answer is here. I'm kind of stumbling around.
Yeah.
No, yeah.
A lot tough. I was thinking about this, and a lot of the protagonists in Girl with Curious Hair were female as well. And they didn't really do it for me. The stories were good. There's a lesbian
couple. I mean, right? There's a lesbian couple, and
and Little Expressionless Animals,
small expressionless animals.
Little,
and then My
None
Appearance.
of them really were like, yes, that is definitely the essence of womanhood. Like none of them. Whereas like with Hal, even though he's like totally unable to speak and inside of his own head, you can I shouldn't really speak to that, but it seems to me that he has more of a personality that maybe you could identify with him as a boy, not just like a person, but a boy. But I'm not one of those, so I can't really say that.
Well, and I mean, one of the things that makes this so complex too is that to make that judgment, you necessarily have to bring in some kind of authorial reading of the author's life. Right? Like you're looking at him then as this guy and what you know about his biography, and then making a judgment that he's, putting too much of himself into the character, or making some other, judgment about like, well, I don't like it because I know the author is like this way. I read a bad thing about the author, and that colors your reading of the character. And I'm not saying it's bad. I mean, I do the same thing. Like I can't read about some authors without knowing something about their life. But I just think that this is a hard thing. Like then what is the answer? Like what is, should men even write from the point of view of women? And if so, how do they do that without failing at it? And I'll leave that for another.
I'm going to leave this for Diego because I don't write fiction.
Yeah, all right. Oh, my God. This is a really good question. I've been turning my wheels over here, Andrea, since you said that. And I'm thinking, like, I got two wheels going. One is, when's the last time I've read a character who I really identified with as a man? Where I was like, this is a male character, and I like this protagonist, or I'm compelled by this person because of some ingrained masculinity or something masculine.
It's not something that really even occurs to me.
I think
like, yeah,
I know, right? Or does it, right? I don't know. I was reading the first book in Octavia Butler's Lilith's Brood. And it's fresh in my mind, and the protagonist is a woman, Lilith, obviously. And I'm trying to think about the prose, and what about the prose convinces me that this character is a woman. And it's just one example out of many, but I'm just thinking about, there's several sort of relationships that kind of come and go. Relationships with aliens are also happening. And I don't know if I could write a paper on it, but there is something about the texture of the prose. That's the thing. I don't know if I could make a case and be like, yep, that's how a woman would speak, or that's how a woman would think. But there's something to that, though. That because of like what you said about Lenore ringing so. Like, and I agree with you. It's just like a gender swapped stand-in for young DF Dub. It seems. Maybe that's not the most generous reading.
No, I totally agree with you, and I think maybe he was trying to hide. We shouldn't try to speak for him, but it's a podcast, so we're gonna do it anyway. Maybe he was trying to hide behind it. It's like an extra mask if he adds a vagina to it or something.
I mean, so another thing, a piece I want to link to in the comments of the show notes after for this episode is a piece that was in Thought Catalog after the D.T. Max biography came out. And it's written by Kristen Rupinian, who is now famous for having written Cat Person in the New Yorker, which is a pretty great story if you haven't read it or been part of the conversation around it has been sort of... viral or something. But the argument that she makes in there is a pretty devastating piece, bringing in this very issue about like how we have this idea of who David Foster Wallace was in our heads, and that sort of colors our reading of his fiction. She makes the point that this terrible stuff that came out about him in the biography, and there's a lot of him being an asshole in general, that should sort of destroy any kind of like David Foster Wallace community or like worship of Wallace or like cult of Wallace stuff. And I don't know how to feel about that, because I feel like my own experience is a little bit different, and that I've never been one to think that he was a saint or never been one to think that he's above criticism or that his work is all perfect, or, I've always been very mixed and complicated in a lot of my feelings and emotions about this. But I also think she's got some pretty good points that sort of the opposite happened. After the book came out, it added to his fame and reputation, maybe in a negative way. And I think what I was saying earlier about like some people, their first reaction is like, oh, he's this bro dude. Like, maybe some of it comes from the biography. I wanted to get, you guys' opinions on the biography.
I think the line about his letter in his letter to Jonathan Franzen about what he feels his purpose in life is. Do you guys remember this line?
I don't know.
He sometimes feels like the reason he was put on the planet was to see how many vaginas he could put his
penis
male organ into. Which,
well, thank you for making me the only one that didn't say vagina, or making me not the only one that said vagina. You're
welcome, Andrea. I'm here to accommodate. But like that phrase obviously is pretty, appalling, and reading that you're just like, whoa, man, that's pretty gnarly.
But I know people
I think he meant it from a biological perspective.
Yeah,
right?
right.
This is what it feels like. I'm hardwired like that. This is what the purpose of life feels like. Which, so things like that probably don't help for his reputation in the biography, and then of course all the stuff with Mary Carr's husband.
I'm telling her you said that.
Freudian
edit
slip.
that out
Mary Carr's husband and the murder plot and all that kind of stuff. Which I'm still very curious to hear more about that, and I wish that I'd asked Dan Max about it more and we had him on the show. But it feels almost like a topic that maybe we shouldn't be talking about in some ways, because it's like it's so sketchy. I don't know, but I want to know more.
I think it is, and I think, Andrea, you were about to say that some people who kind of are think like that or talk like that, and I think everybody does. And
if any of you try to say that you don't know somebody who has implied or said something like that, you are a liar. Like, I went to an all-women's college, and I know people who said stuff like that in college. So if anybody tries to say that they don't, and that's like what I try to say to my students is, like, when we're reading Brief Interviews with Hideous Men, I try to tell them, you are going to find yourself in one of these men. I'm not going to ask you who it is, but you're going to find yourself, and you're going to feel weird. But that's the point. Yeah. And I think that if the people who are saying, oh, God, he's a horrible person because he said that to Jonathan Franzen, well, part of me is like, fuck Jonathan Franzen for telling people that, because don't tell people the gross things that your friend said after he died. But, like, at the same time, it makes him look more, to me, that should have, I don't think it did for a lot of people, but it should have toned down the St. Dave kind of thing.
Yeah, you would think so.
But then he also, I don't know if it was from the same letter with Jonathan Franzen, but he said something completely brilliant about words. He said something about, like, if words are all we have as world and God, then we must treat them with, I'm not looking at a quote, so I apologize. Then we must treat them with care and we must worship or something. It's like, how does the same person say that?
Right.
Like, how do those words, the same words and the same phrases fall out of the same person's mouth? So, like, everybody regards him as this huge genius, and he wrote this 1,000-page endnote-filled genius book that we know is not a genius book because it's got flaws. God forbid we talk about them. And then he also kind of wanted to have a lot of sex. So
I still think it's a genius book. I think it might be flawed, but it's
I couldn't write it, so
I don't think anyone else can write it.
Those comments that we're talking about, it was in correspondence, you know, and with canonization, and especially with the early passing, we wouldn't have known this stuff. And I think that it as it uncovers it, I absolutely agree. It should temper the adulation, the unadulterated adulation, right? Yeah. But also, like, people are people, and people are complex, and people say shitty things, and we can enjoy both and talk about how they were kind of problematic in private and problematic in what they wrote. And I keep thinking about the comparison that comes to mind, because somebody was talking about it this weekend, was like Louis C.K. And you go back and rewatch some of his old bits. He's got this hilarious bit about smoking weed, and how, like, the weed today is just bonkers compared to whatever he used to smoke. And I can laugh and I can enjoy that. But then always in the forefront of watching that is all the shit that was going on behind the scenes. So it absolutely kind of changes the viewing. And for me, it changes the viewing of that, because I think that's important, you know.
I never liked him, Louis C.K.
Let me just state for the record.
But I will tell you, I think that this conversation is, you know, sort of what's happening in the society at large right now, and you know, reckoning with a person's art and their personality, and really what they've done and what they've been accused of, and, like, the details of it matters. And I'll be honest with you, I think it's harder when that person is dead and not here to defend themselves. And all of this stuff comes out after the fact, and guess what? The only, you know, thing that we can hear is one person's side of a story. And honestly, the stuff that Wallace has been accused of, I mean, there's a lot in there of, like, speaking negatively about women in general. And I think that that's problematic. I think it's bad, and I don't condone it, right? But I also think for me, I have to judge it in the context of sort of all, you know, I weigh it on one side of, like, how bad is this offense? And for some people, they might be like, you know what, I'm checked out. That's done. And I respect that. Yeah. I'm not one of those people who thinks this is the all-time greatest writer that everyone in the world needs to read. I am a book person, and I think there's a lot of wisdom and humanity in books, and Wallace is part of that. But I don't think like you have to love this one writer in one book. And, like, if you're a woman and you read that biography and you say, you know what, fuck this guy for all eternity, I can never go back and read him, I respect that decision.
Yeah. Yeah, it's funny. I'm not actually. That's funny you say that. Now I'm not all that interested in convincing people to read him.
Me neither. Me neither.
Like really, I'm thinking about our work with the diversity blog, and it was really more a call for like people who have read and have a qualm to air or something, rather than, and like people who want to, like, do we salvage this? Or is this still worth some, like, reading again or something? And much less interested in being, yeah, I agree with you. It's less about being like an evangelist, I guess, an evangelist for St. Dave. I don't really have any interest in that. Like, if someone was like, yeah, I hate David Foster Wallace, I'd be like, okay, right on.
Probably not the blog for you then.
Right.
I mean, there's plenty of people, and I think that's to me the sign of like a writer that will endure is like one that doesn't have to be defended. It's like, I mean, there are plenty of, if you look at the I'm super interested right now in like the list of ALA societies. Like there are 200 or 300 single author societies in there, right? And a lot of them are much more established than others. But you look at like what gets studied in academia is just one measure, but like what gets read, it's interesting to see what endures because of the author, and then what endures sort of in spite of the author, if that makes any sense.
Yeah.
Yeah, you got all deep, and now we don't know what to say.
Sorry, I didn't take it off. But I mean, this thing that, some of it I think feels like legit concerns that were not necessarily part of the conversation 10 years ago, 20 years ago. And, Wallace himself, if he, I like to think like if he had written, maybe he would have changed his characters a little bit. Maybe we would have changed his ways. But even at the last Wallace conference, 2017, there was a good paper about the female characters in The Pale King. Does anyone remember this? And guess what? They're also sort of like caricatures and not really complex. And, there's a good thing in there about Meredith Rand and Tony Ware. Tony Ware is like one of my favorite characters. I think Lucas Thompson actually wrote about Tony Ware as like a strong female character, but he had based it on, I think he based some of Tony Ware on a grad student that he knew. And Lucas Thompson makes that connection in a paper. So that just to say, like, well, I'm hopeful that, maybe as he lived through, say, 3 or 4 or 5 decades of writing, he would not end up like Philip Roth, but be someone who is a little more modern, progressive in their representations. But I also think it's a hard question to solve of like, how do you properly represent the world in your fiction, and still achieve your sort of fictional truth? I don't know. That's
right. And is that the burden of the writer? I mean, is that what we expect when we go in to read something? Maybe in some ways. Maybe it's not.
I think we can only expect one author to represent one part of, like, in this case, his experience. We can't expect him to represent the entire world.
Which is why I just whenever you just said that, I'm thinking of his nonfiction, and like that's some of my favorite writing, because it's just unabashedly stripped away any pretense of. Well, I mean, that's not true. He creates a character, right? But sure. It's obviously so much more. He doesn't have to put on the mask. He doesn't have to put on like the Lenore get up. It's just this amped up version of his own observations, which I find more authentic. I find it more convincing. I also connect with it more.
Yeah, I think that because you did pose a question in the emails about like where would his writing be now, sort of in the wake of all of this diversity stuff that we have to focus on, and his writing kind of morphed so much in even just a relatively short career, that I think it's almost impossible for us to say for sure what it would have looked like. But had he stayed working at a college or a university, he would be part of these conversations that we're all part of. Like I'm part of the Committee for Institutional Diversity and Equity, and we have to talk about these things all the time. Are we including enough diverse everything for our students? So he would be very, very aware of it. And anytime he's aware of something, it shows up in his writing. And it's almost like he so it would be in there even if it was hidden or buried or masked in some way. And I feel like, and this is completely 100% my opinion, and you can all disagree with it and like boo me and throw things at me. I think Dave, you'd have to throw it especially far, but
yeah,
it would sort of be like this meta diversity kind of thing that you have to dredge up from somewhere. And of course, everybody would be arguing about it, whether it's actually there or not. But that's sort of just my opinion. I don't think he would be straightforward about it, because I don't know that he was ever, at least in the fiction, was never straightforward about it. There would be masks all over the place with it.
I think in a way it's sort of a no-win situation, is that if he were somehow able to write some novel that not just like, was from the point of view of like, let's say a black woman, it's like, it's gonna feel, is that ever gonna succeed? Is that ever gonna be free of like legit criticism? It's like, I don't know. And it's like, it seems like a tough thing to approach. And I think there's a bit in Signifying Rappers where he talks about, and that was written in like 1988, but he talks a little bit about like not wanting to completely try to co-opt this, like writing about, I'll have to dig up the quote for our show notes, but he is aware of the issue in the late 1980s.
The appropriation issue. Yeah.
But it's also like this tokenization issue. Like I feel like some of the characters in Infinite Jest just feel like tokens. And I feel like that's an issue too, even in our conferences. And it's like, do we, how much do we value actually bringing in new voices versus just like, oh, let's get a token black person on this conference, Like I think that's a hard thing. What Andrea was saying about, having these discussions of even if they're difficult, even bringing people in, bringing them together, getting consensus on it might be very difficult. It might take a long time, but I think that's what the future is. Like, it's not ignoring it or like getting, I don't know, bent out of shape about it forever again. Like, I think we have to move forward to bring people into this conversation. And it's not just Wallace. I mean, this is a bigger like community issue is what I see it.
Yeah, I agree. But I'm also wondering, like, why would we expect him to be able to write from the perspective of a black woman? Like, why would that be an expectation?
Yeah, that'd be
weird, right? And then I'm thinking that would be, is it a criticism then that he doesn't write about, a book from anything other than his own perspective? And this is true of like other writers, right? This is like a broader issue. Like Saul Bellow was criticized for writing Henderson the Rain King, which is a book about Africa without ever going to Africa. And it's like, can you just imagine it? Like, and I think this is a question I have for both of you is like, do you think that Wallace's inability to do this is somewhat a failure of imagination, or empathy of how others experience the world? Or should that be a concern of great literature?
Well, what you just mentioned made me think of a book that won, I believe it was either the National Book Award or the National Book Critics Circle Award. I think it was the National Book Award. It's a book called The News from Paraguay, and my father's from Paraguay. And in her acceptance speech, the author just blatantly outright said, "Oh, I didn't even go there. I didn't even visit. I just made it all up." And that's just such an egregious slap in the face of people who have lived the experience. And you think you can just, with your white imagination, conjure up a peoples and a culture and a history and use it to win awards? It's like really offensive. And I feel like in Signifying Rappers more than anywhere else, they're both he and Costello are both so aware of not appropriating and just, you know, situating themselves as these two nerds who like rap and just want to approach it from their point of investigation. And I think it works really well. And then you see in the fiction, so much of his fiction is just laden with concerns about empathy and how do we do that? Is it even possible? And I know this is not exactly answering your question, but I wonder if part of the failure there is getting sort of stuck or frozen on the question of, can you ever really connect with another person? Like, there's so much of that to the point where it sort of gets, in my opinion, it gets a little bit like, I get it. It's hard to connect with people. I get it. But you know, but there's something there too. I don't know.
He's got that line in the McCaffrey interview about how in the real world true empathy is impossible, and the only way we can even approach it. I'm not directly quoting again. The only way we can even approach it is in fiction.
Because of imaginative access.
It gives us imaginative access to other selves, and I don't think that any one author should be expected to write about the experience of everyone. Like Hemingway, I don't think I've ever read anything by Hemingway that didn't have some like super masculine war guy, other than that one story that is anthologized everywhere about, I think it's called Soldier's Home, about the war guy who comes home and is sad. Junot Diaz, every book or story I've read by him is about Dominican immigrants, which is great because that gives voice to Dominican immigrants. But why would we expect him to write about other types of immigrants? And like Sherman Alexie, everything he writes is about, particularly Spokane, he calls them Indians. He prefers Indian to Native American, so I've gotten used to saying that, so I apologize if that's offensive to anybody. But we don't expect Sherman Alexie to go write about a bunch of white dudes or from the perspective of a bunch of white dudes. So I don't know why we would expect the white guy to write from the perspective of something other than the white guy. I would expect him or hope that he wouldn't have such problematic representations of non-white guys. But we can't win everything.
I'm trying to think of a book that's done it well. I mean, maybe if readers out there who are better read than us, like, write in and tell us, like, here's a guy who, you know, wrote from the perspective of a woman or someone else and did it well. I would be curious to hear that. I think most of those, what you're saying is sort of, I'm agreeing with, and mentally I'm shaking my head, yes, because a lot of those, like trying to leap over the wall of self into someone else, pretty much every case I can think of that, of someone narrating a story that is not really their own, fails, except maybe in science fiction, like where you're like an orc or something.
Tolkien's the only guy who nailed it.
But then there's no appropriation, there's no risk.
Because orcs don't actually exist in reality. Is that what you're saying?
I'm sorry, did I ruin something?
We talked about some of this too with Claire Hayes Brady, episode 21, and Claire is the editor of our journal now, Wallace Studies Journal, and she's written a lot about the unspeakable failures of David Foster Wallace. And then
I've had that book out from my college's library for over a year, and I think I'm not giving it back.
Well, Dave and I spent a lot of time with it before we talked with her in 2016, and I feel like this is a conversation that's been ongoing, and it will continue to be ongoing for many more, conferences and papers and books to come. Yeah. And I feel like I'm talking too much in this episode. I feel like I need to shut up.
No.
Well, I think one of you said something, and now I can't remember what it was, but it made me think of brief interview number 20, which is one that I end up spending a lot of time with my students if I assign it, which I don't always. It really depends on the class. And and how often that interview is so misread. And I think it was in Claire Hayes Brady's book where she says something about how that particular interview is, I think she says it.
This is the granola cruncher, right?
Yes,
the
granola cruncher. She says that interview number 20 interrogates misogyny. I think that's the way she puts it. And I kind of agreed with her. I'm trying to remember. I presented on this at last year's ALA actually, with us, with our society. So in that interview, the granola cruncher is silent. The female interviewer is silent, and all we have is this horrible guy who I'm pretty sure is trying to pick up the interviewer at a bar based on. Does anybody else get that impression, or did I make that up? Like, he keeps buying her drinks. He's using the story of another woman's rape to try to pick somebody up. And Wallace allows the women to just let him bury himself in that story. And there's a point at which he says, these and other details she withheld. So he's telling her story. He has completely, the interviewee has completely appropriated this woman's story of her rape and added details to it in order to try to pick someone up at a bar. It's like the grossest thing in the entire world. And there's an article published calling it I'm misquoting, but there's an actual published article calling it a glorification of rape culture. Like, if you read that article and understand anything, or if you read the story and understand anything about Wallace, you know that that's not what's happening in this story. And I think that by allowing the interviewer to remain silent, there's something to that I think is really, really important. And I haven't totally fleshed it out in a way that I can say it verbally yet. And Claire might have in her book. I feel like she has, and I just forgot now. But
you'll have to go read it and get back to
it. I have it.
I do think there is a huge level of self-awareness in that story, because there's a lot of what he's doing there about exactly what we're talking about, of how do you identify with another person, and this sort of over-the-top story about how she escaped from this rapist was that she got him to identify with her, and that was like literally saving her life. And so I think there is like a thing there about him talking about the purpose of fiction, and there's a funny thing that story ends with the phrase "end of story," which is, I feel like, is a criticism of him, of like, oh, you don't know how to end a story, Dave.
I'll show you.
But there's so many stories that he doesn't end. He doesn't end Broom of the System. He ends Forever Overhead with hello.
But he's aware of it. I think he's very conscious of it. And just the fact that you're not really aware of it when you're reading it. It's like a guy, you're reading this monologue. And then you get to the guy defending himself, and he's like, I'm done with it. Like, end of story. And then but if you read it as a reader, it's like, it's hilarious that he ends it with end of story.
But it's not hilarious if you look at the interviewee, if you look at this guy, number 20, who's sitting here calling this woman.
That's the only hilarious detail.
But outside of that,
that's the only hilarious detail. It's not a hilarious story.
Correct.
I do think it's misread. I do think it's misunderstood. And I actually think it's some of his like best work in the book. And underappreciated. It was published originally as a standalone story in the Paris Review.
But I feel like it's in that story, by not writing what the interviewer says, it's almost like he's not appropriating the woman's voice. He's allowing the woman, even though she's silent, allowing the woman's voice to kind of be whatever it needs to be. So I just feel like there's something to that. The cues left open.
It's very powerful.
And most of my students are just like, that's so annoying. Why can't we just read the story?
So, I mean, there's issues like this, which I think are super valuable to get into the work and actually say, oh, what were you bothered by? And that's sort of what that post with Sean Gander brings out, is says, you know what? this actually is problematic. Like this story, it actually did put me off, and here's why. I think that's super valuable. There's the other issue. We've kind of jumped back and forth, but it's on my mind right now because we're coming up to conference season. And Diego, are you going to be there?
Oh yeah, I'm going to be there with my father-in-law.
Oh,
awesome.
Cool.
Awesome.
Has he read Infinite Jest?
Yeah, and not to give anything away,
cool.
he's a physiatrist, and he said that he learned more about alcoholism from reading Infinite Jest than he did through his medical training. He was like blown away. It changed how he understands treatment for alcoholism.
Wow, that's crazy.
I can't wait to talk to him about this. But I was going to say we're jumping back and forth because there's a big issue right now about conferences in general and representation. You know, we said at the top of the show, Tony, who organized the Oz Wallace conference in Melbourne, worked really hard to get, about 50-50 split. And I mean, I would love to see more progress made towards that. But I will tell you, like behind the scenes, it can be difficult whenever we get panels that are like all white dudes, and that is still hard. I want to get you guys' opinion on this because like I don't ever want to get in the position of being like, let's add a guy to the panel because he's LGBT, or let's add a guy just because the paper doesn't work and we wouldn't accept it, but we really need someone that's this representation. So what do you guys think about that?
Yeah, that's a good one because it's like that old question about quality and quota, and how quotas can I don't know how I feel about it, is why I'm waffling here, but that quotas can dilute quality, and I don't know if that's personally, I don't know if that's true. And even if it is, I kind of think that's a sacrifice that needs to be made, kind of thing. But it's a bit more complicated than that. I think that I think that the work of the society can I think in problematizing it, invite people who would otherwise be hesitant or who may have been put off by it, or even just who haven't even dived in because of the reputation, like we were talking about earlier, that they may find spaces of entry and they may find things that are worth redeeming or worth connecting with. And I hear you on the panels. God damn, the panels that not just the DFW conference, but just every conference ever. Like, how do you move away from the homogenous panels? And it's not as easy as just being like, oh, hey, you and you, can you hop on this panel, and just so that we look, so we have a semblance of diversity or superficial diversity. But I also think along those lines, it's important to recognize different types of diversity as well, like in terms of not just gender and race or ethnicity, but even age and profession and experience and language and nationality and all these other ways to approach it. I mean, Wallace has been translated into God knows how many languages. And last year, there were quite a few wonderful, like mind-blowing panels that included folks from all over the world, and two of them, a guy from Mexico and a woman from Bulgaria, I think. They actually sent us their stuff, and we needed to. Well, I needed to edit it into a bloggable format. But like that's even a form of diversity, right? Where maybe even if the gender and the race or ethnicity question is still, we're still thinking about and working on. I think that's one way that also reflects the global Wallace, right? Title of that book.
Yeah, I completely agree that there's the sort of invisible diversity, like the stuff that you can't necessarily see, but totally enriches the experience. And I to kind of answer your question, I it's hard because you don't want to have a panel full of white young dudes with beards, though your beards are lovely. I'm
gonna shave it off after
yeah, your beards are all very lovely, but you don't want to just like throw somebody in there just for the sake of diversity and then have like a totally disjointed panel. But I'm sort of in the same boat as Diego in that hopefully through these conversations and through the blog and through just admitting the problems that exist, it'll entice a more diverse readership, and I don't know if writership is a word, but more people to attend and to write and to submit and like be part of this sort of awesome community. And I don't say it's an awesome community because you include me in it, though that is pretty awesome. But like, I posted about this last year, but I somehow ended up, I had to swap panels with somebody in terms of moderating, and I ended up moderating a science fiction panel, which is not my forte, but it was a very cool experience at first because I looked at our panel and it was one presenter couldn't show up, but it was two women, and one of them was presenting on The Brief Wondrous Life of Oscar Wilde as a piece of science fiction, and one of them was presenting on a Asian woman author who I cannot remember, but I thought it was like one of the least typical science fiction things ever. And then I looked around the room and it was a bunch of older white men and Mary Holland.
Oh no.
And I was like, oh no. So the Q&A just became these guys like talking to each other. Well, I think. I'm like, well, can we hear what our presenters think? And it just became like white dudes talking to other white dudes about what, like, they stopped talking about what the panel was. And I just, like, why did this just happen? And then in the Wallace panel that I presented on, it was 2 women and 1 guy, and we were all at totally different stages in our careers, and the audience was totally I keep saying totally, edit that out too. The audience was much more diverse, and it was a conversation. It wasn't like a bunch of dudes all agreeing with each other and patting themselves on the back for being how clever they are. So I am patting us on the back because I think that we're not perfect, obviously, but we're fostering a much richer conversation than some communities are. And I think it takes time. I think we are going to still have some panels with a bunch of bearded white dudes from time to time. And I think that's your beards are lovely, so I think it's okay. But I think it has to happen a little bit more organically than, oh no, we have a white dude panel, let's go find a Latino dude or a woman or someone who's clearly LGBT. Like, they're not going to check off a box when they submit a paper. So, and I think I'm going to keep rambling for a second because Dave can like make his money or whatever you do. I don't even know. But you can edit a lot of this out.
You think I make my money editing this podcast?
Yes.
Sold like how many stickers, Matt?
Yeah.
More than 10.
It'll pay the bills.
I've got stickers I can send you. I'll pay you in stickers. But the other problem is that when you create a panel, you're trying to find some sort of almost similar papers, and people who are similar might write about similar things. So sometimes it just might not happen that way. If you're creating a Wallace and gender panel, you might have a whole panel of women, which is not, it's great because now you've got a whole bunch of women talking about Wallace, but that's not exactly diverse. So, I'm done rambling now, so I'll shut up.
Well, the society, I would say, we came to be as sort of a natural outgrowth of partly of the ISU conferences and partly people who were already functioning like an informal community already. And, you know, this is all this volunteer of people who really love this one author's writing. And I think I'm going to put in a plug now to say, if you want to be involved, reach out, reach out to us. Like, we definitely do not want anyone to not feel welcome. We don't want anyone to feel excluded. And I say we because I don't feel like, even though I am the president of the society, I don't feel like it's my thing. I feel like I am part of it. And I was not at the 2016 conference. I've never been to any of the international conferences, and we've had a bunch. So I feel like I'm a part of a bigger thing, and I think that it needs to have a lot of people participating in order to be viable long term. Mm-hmm. And I hope that more people want to share their story and get involved, and we want to just make it, as easy and welcoming as possible for them to do that. So reach out to us, info@dfwsociety.org if you want to email us.
Yeah, Tony doesn't even have a beard, so it's not a requirement.
And again, Tony's also like a non-traditional academic in some ways, and that he, is like me. He's like a dad, right? And he came to academia late.
It's like a dad.
And it came to academia late, right? And I mean, he's an interesting dude, and that's why, like, to me, I take some of this as like, I have to shake my head a little bit, because I look at a lot of the people and I see a lot of individual cases who I know their life story, or I know their, this person is from Germany and they're not a native speaker and they have a different background. What we call is just like, white dudes is like, do you really, are we all the same? Like this guy from rural Australia and this guy from like, urban Germany and this dude from Illinois, like, it's like, it just seems like a little too easy to lump all of those people into one generic category that you can write off. But this happens. I'm not defending it, but I just think that if you get to know some of these people, it changes your mind a little bit about stereotypes. I don't know where I was going with that. So.
No, I think it was nice though.
Partly just to really say we can always use more help organizing conferences, people reading papers, giving us feedback. We have a lot of this opportunity. So if you're out there listening, you want to be more involved, reach out to us. Go on the website. There's a form you can fill out. You can say, I want to be more involved. You can email us we'll give our email address always at the end of every show. I think it's greatconcavity@gmail.com. Concavity show. Damn it, I got it wrong.
concavityshow@gmail.com.
So anyways, before we get to that of where to reach out to us, is there anything that we have talked over you and not given you a chance to say? Andrea, Diego, either one of you any final thoughts here?
I just wanted to, because I wanted to read this quote off the back of one of my copies of Signifying Rappers, because it's such a different tone than like the Wardine chapters and all that in Infinite Jest. And it's really badass because, again, yeah, right, this came out in 80 whatever, 88, 87, 88, but it's one of the pull quotes. He says that rap is today's pop music's lone cutting edge, the new, the unfamiliar. The brain resisted while body boogies. And that resisted, alien, exhilarating cutting edge has always been black and always an augury of pop's very near future. And I'm like, this is coming from someone who went on to do whatever, a bunch of other problematic stuff, blah, 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 but also a lot of really good and deep and mind-bending stuff. And I'm so interested in that, and like this recognition of an art form that is not his own and never will be, and is even approached with that very much in the forefront of his mind. And yet to say something like that, and this is something like I could have, like, this kind of quote could have been applied to like Black Panther, that just came out. Like the cutting edge has always been black, et cetera, et cetera. And I just think that is something worth pursuing. And it's not to say that it's the best example. Obviously, it's not. Lots of, writers of color and women writers and writers from other countries are doing exceedingly incredible stuff. But I keep coming back to these little, especially this, and it's like an anchor for me. And I'm interested in pursuing that more. And if anyone who is listening is if that resonates with you, get in touch with me and let's rap. Let's talk.
Pun intended.
Yeah.
That's cool. I don't think I've read that. That's really, it's him giving credit where it's due, I guess. That's interesting.
I was just going to add that if anybody's interested in adding to the diversity conversation or letting us know something that you think should happen or be on the blog, or if you have an idea for a blog post, well, first take a look at what we have. Some of them are formal, some are not so formal. We don't really have like rules. So you can, I mean, I guess we should have some rules. But you can email Diego and I, well, me and Diego at, I think we're diversity@dfwsociety.org. That goes to us.
Sounds right.
We're official. So email us with whatever. If you want to fight, if you want to talk, if you want to write something, anything. If you have ideas, we like ideas.
That's great. That's an awesome invitation, and I really appreciate the work that the diversity committee is thinking about in making, this community more invitational, and opening up the conversation about Wallace to as many people as want to get in on it. I think that's fantastic. So thank you guys so much for your input there, and for your time on this episode. It's been amazing to hear from you guys.
Yeah, thank you.
It's been really cool.
Thanks for the show.
We should definitely give a shout out to the other diversity committee members, though. They're Ashley, Cynthia, Ryan, and Danielle. They're awesome and often do more work than we do. Ashley is like a genius and a wizard when it comes to blog posts. She's like, here, 9 blog posts that I came up with last night. Okay, give us an order and we'll go for it. So they're just an
Ashley
awesome.
Contos, right?
Yeah, Ashley Contos, Danielle Eli, Cynthia Zhang, and Ryan. There's too many Ryans. Lackey. They're awesome people to work with, and even if we go months without emailing, someone will say, "Hey guys, are we still around?"
Yeah.
So they're great to work with. So I just wanted to make sure that they got recognition.
Awesome.
Yeah.
And that series of blog posts, I hope that people who are listening go and seek out and read some of those, because we didn't accomplish as much as I'd hoped in our first year of a society. Turns out it's really hard to organize a brand new group of people and get the journal out, which is a whole nother story. Yeah. But we've made progress in a lot of ways. But I think for me, the thing that I'm most proud of is that those series of blog posts that are out there. And like Diego said, they will live on and they will be up there, and people can leave comments on them and post links on Twitter and really engage with them more, I hope. But I'm very proud of the work that you and your team did on getting those out there. They exceeded my wildest expectations of what we could have done in the first year of that.
Definitely.
Awesome.
Andrea, where can people find you online other than through the email address that you gave? Twitter?
I am on Twitter.
Other places? Cool.
I think my Twitter handle is NMN80418.
Really?
Whatever's
easy.
At the very end of no, it's whatever's at the end of Good Old Neon.
Oh, cool.
Oh,
very cryptic.
Yeah.
We'll link to that in the show notes as well.
Yeah.
Cool.
I don't Twitter well. I Twitter. I don't tweet well, but
it's so it's Neil's initials plus the year he graduated high school, 1980, plus his batting average in
nice.
Yeah.
American Legion.
So I think it's 418.
418.
Yeah, he's pretty good.
Cool.
That's awesome.
Cool. That's a good batting average. Yeah. I wouldn't know.
I actually
400.
I have I'm going to reveal this to you, and you can choose not to put this on the podcast, but I have a fairly large Wallace tattoo on my leg, and it says it's a bandana, and it says "not another word," and then there's an asterisk, and I have a footnote on my foot of that little thing because I couldn't resist it. It's so cheesy, but I had to do it.
That was brilliant.
So it's there.
I love it.
I could have just looked at my foot, but yeah.
And that's your Twitter handle on your foot.
Yep.
Yeah. Cool. Awesome. Anywhere else you can be found, can be connected with that, Andrea? Is that the best place?
Yep, that's probably it.
Awesome. Cool. And how about you, Diego?
Yeah, my Twitter's a bit easier to remember. I think it's Diego_Báez. That's me.
All right.
Yeah.
Awesome. So the people can find you there. Good stuff. Matt, how about us? Where can people find the show?
I got the email address wrong, so I'll get it right. It's concavityshow@gmail.com, and Twitter's concavityshow. Instagram, I think, is Concavity Show, at Concavity Show.
Yeah, we pretty much just picked that one handle and went with it. So
pretty much it. So yeah, but reach out to us. We've got several people who emailed us after the last episode, and we really appreciate those emails and enjoy when people hit us up with questions or comments. So please feel free to do that. I'll also put in a plug to say, if you've never gone on Apple Podcasts or iTunes and rated or reviewed our show, it helps us move up into the rankings of like literature podcasts, and we would love that if you do like a just rate it.
Yeah, please do.
Or give us a review.
Preferably 4 out of 5 stars would be good.
That was Dave's paper last year, was partly about getting 4 out of 5 stars on from my
mother-in-law.
Yeah. So I would expect if you're a mother-in-law listening, if you're my mother-in-law, give me the 5 stars.
Yeah, we deeply appreciate that. It helps us reach a larger audience of people who might be interested in Wallace, and of course, that fits this discussion very well of reaching a wider audience and getting a proliferation of different interested people in this community. So that'd be fantastic. As always, we want to thank Robin O'Neill and Parquet Courts for letting us use their art and song. And once again, Andrea, Diego, thank you guys so much for coming on.
Thank you.
All right. I won't see you at the ISU conference, unfortunately, because I'm down here in New Zealand for a while, but hopefully the one after that.